How you doing? This is Jim Fisher. Welcome to the Third Way, not left, not right, America's Third Way, libertarianism. Today I wanted to talk to you about Abraham Lincoln and the history surrounding the Civil War period. The reason I want to discuss this subject is because it's a great example of revisionist history and how a lot of what we're taught in history in elementary and middle and high school is really just not true. And, we're all taught that Lincoln was the guy that saved the Union, and he was an abolitionist, and he was for equal rights. And the truth of the matter is Lincoln was not a supporter of equal rights. He spoke a lot about liberty in his speeches and stuff, but when it came to actual action, he was not an abolitionist. And, the rest of the world managed to abolish slavery with no violence whatsoever. And the United States did not. So why did that happen? Lincoln himself, I personally view as a tyrant and really the first dictator of the United States. A lot of us think that Obama or Bush was the first president to launch a military invasion without the consent of Congress. That is not true. And I think if you pay attention to politics, you've even heard Obama invoke Lincoln's name. Lincoln is the first president to launch military invasion without the consent of Congress, which is unconstitutional. He blockaded several ports in the South without declaring war, without the consent of Congress. All the facts that I'm going to be telling you now, most of them come from Thomas DiLorenzo's book, The Real Lincoln, and his lectures. Look it up yourself. Don't rely on my word. This is all referenced material. So one of the first things Lincoln did when he got into office was he unilaterally suspended the writ of habeas corpus. So for those of you that don't know what that is, habeas corpus is your rights when you get arrested. So it's your right to confront your accuser, your right to a speedy trial, etc., etc. So that's how our justice system ensures that you have rights, and the government can't just snatch you up and do whatever they will with you. So that was one of the first things that Lincoln did, and he did not do this with the approval of Congress. Later on, Congress did approve the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, but for quite some time, Lincoln just did this on his own without any approval from Congress whatsoever. And so this was the military would just go and snatch you up. Many times the families didn't know if you spoke out against Lincoln or his policies. You would just be arrested and taken off to Fort Lafayette. And this is a kind of a well-known fact in Lincoln's history. All the Lincoln idolaters or pro-Lincoln authors freely acknowledge this, but they just look at it as a necessary evil of the war and what he had to do. He appointed William Seward, who was the Secretary of State, and appointed him in charge of the secret police force, which had spies and which would arrest people and call them spies, or anybody that was speaking out against the government or Lincoln's policy of war, he would have them arrested. And there's this kind of fallacy that's promoted that this was only Southerners or people that were involved in the war, and that's absolutely not true. Most of the people that were arrested under the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus were Northerners. And just to give you some examples, he had the mayor of Baltimore arrested. He had Congressman Henry May, who was a congressman of Maryland, arrested. All these guys with no trial, no nothing. They just got snatched up and put in jail. 20 members of the Maryland legislature were arrested. He had countless newspapers. The estimates are over 300 newspapers across the United States. So not just in any local area, across the entire United States at that time, which was a bit smaller than today. But the United States had a population of about 30 million back then, so it was about 1/10 of what it is today. And estimates of over 300 newspapers being shut down is basically, would be a good portion of all the news. So any newspaper that said anything negative about Lincoln or spoke out against him was either shut down, or the other tool he would use was not give them the use of the U.S. mail. So back then you didn't have paper boys and stuff. All newspapers were delivered through the United States mail, who had a monopoly on mail. There was no FedEx or anything like that. So if they prevented you from being able to use the mail, then they prevented you from existing. So that was another method he used. He would also send soldiers in to smash up machinery, printing machinery, and things like that. So this was another tyrannical act that Lincoln did. Imagine Bush or Obama or a president today doing, shutting down the New York Post or the New York Times. And at that time, Lincoln had the two biggest newspapers in New York actually shut down. So, there's this kind of myth of Northern unity against the South during the Civil War, and it's a fallacy. Of course, if you shut down every opposing opposing view and shut down all the news, you will end up, historically it'll look like, yes, there was this Northern unity because nobody spoke out against it. You didn't have to shut down every last newspaper. You just had to shut down all the big ones. And guess what? Everybody else will fall in line. He had judges arrested. He had, congressmen arrested. I mean, this man was a tyrant. Could you imagine a president doing that today? He had all telegraph communications intercepted and censored. He had the railroads nationalized. He even had federal troops interfere with northern elections. So, I mean, you can imagine a president getting caught with that today. He actually told his generals to furlough Republican soldiers during elections and keep the Democrat soldiers in the field. David Donald, who is a historian, was quoted as saying, Lincoln won New York by 7,000 votes with the help of federal bayonets. So this is kind of a well-documented fact. They even, in some polling areas, they would have them use colored ballots so the soldiers would know who to intimidate and who not to intimidate. So Claremont Vallandigham, who was a congressman of Ohio for the House of Representatives, was a very vocal opponent of Lincoln. He spoke out often and very adamantly against Lincoln. He is quoted as saying, Lincoln's army against the South is about nationalizing banks, bankruptcy laws, vast and permanent public debts, high tariffs, heavy direct taxation, enormous expenditure, gigantic peculation. Peculation means stealing or embezzlement. No more state lines, no more state government, consolidated monarchy, centralized military despotism. So he was quoted as saying these things, and you can imagine this would obviously get under Lincoln's skin. So Lincoln sent 67 armed federal soldiers, and they broke into his home, had him arrested, and they first tried to dish him off to the Confederate Army in Tennessee, and they didn't know what to do with him. They didn't want him, so he was actually exiled to Canada. So you can just imagine a president doing that today. Time of war or no time of war. And, the historians give him the excuse of, well, he had to do what he had to do, it's time of war, and yada, yada, yada. This is insanity. He completely dismantled the Constitution, completely dismantled the separation of powers between the judicial branch, the executive branch, and the legislative branch. He also had Roger B. Taney was a Supreme Court justice that ruled his suspension of writ of habeas corpus unconstitutional, and he put out an arrest warrant for him. So he completely violated the separation of powers. So I'm going to do a part 2 to this because I'm almost out of time. So tune in for Lincoln Part 2. It's Jim Fisher signing off for the Third Way, not left, not right, America's Third Way, libertarianism.